At 79 feet underground, Ethan Walker heard Jonah whisper one word through the dark: Ethan. Above them, Atlas barked at the mouth of the well like he had been waiting 26 years for that sound. Mara covered her mouth. Daniel Cross stood silent by the fence, his offer papers still in his hand. The wall of red clay trembled. One bead of water slid down the stone. Jonah looked at Ethan. He was right. Ethan touched the cold earth, his voice barely steady. No, he said. He was patient. But to understand that moment, you have to know what Walter left behind. Ethan Walker was 41 years old when he learned that the only thing Walter Briggs had left him was 38 acres of dead New Mexico dirt, a dry well no one in Red Hollow had trusted in years, and a German shepherd named Atlas, who seemed to understand the will better than any lawyer in the room. No house worth selling, no savings account with a comforting number, no clean little envelope that said, "Here, start over." Just land the color of rust, a circle of old stone covered by a weather-beaten wooden lid, and a dog with amber eyes who had not taken his gaze off Ethan since the funeral. By 4 that afternoon, the sky over Red Hollow had gone the color of pewter, low and heavy, pressing down on the mesa like it had something to say but lacked the mercy to say it. Ethan stood beside his truck at the edge of Briggs' dust lot, hands deep in the pockets of his canvas jacket, boots planted in the powdery earth. The wind moved across the flats in slow, dry breaths, lifting red dust around the old fence posts. He had been back in town for less than 24 hours, and already people had begun using that voice around him, the careful one, the soft one, the one folks saved for veterans, widowers, and men they thought might crack if spoken to plainly. Walter cared about you. Mara Whitcomb had told him after the reading of the will, folding her gloved hands over a purse that looked older than some churches. She was Walter's sister, 73's younger shadow, all straight posture and silver hair, pinned so tight it seemed to pull grief away from her face. But this place is not a gift, Ethan. It is a burden. He had nodded because nodding was easier than explaining that he knew the difference. A burden sat on your chest before dawn and made coffee taste like metal. A burden made you check the locks 3 times, even in a town where nobody locked anything. A burden followed you home from places you had promised yourself were behind you. Land was just land. At least, that was what he told himself. Then Atlas stepped out from behind the truck and walked to the well. The shepherd moved with the quiet authority of an old working dog, black and tan coat dusted at the muzzle, one ear nicked at the tip, shoulders still strong despite the silver threaded through his face. Walter had adopted him 5 years earlier from a veteran support program after Atlas retired from service work, though nobody in Red Hollow seemed to know exactly what kind of service. Search work, some said. Recovery work, others guessed. Walter only ever said, "That dog knows when a man is lying to himself." Atlas reached the wooden lid, lowered his head, and breathed along the seam. Then he sat, not restless, not confused. Waiting. Ethan watched him for a long moment, feeling the strange pull of the place gather somewhere beneath his ribs. The well had been there since before Walter bought the acreage in 1998, back when he was still the county water engineer and still believed reports could change people's minds. Folks said he spent the last 26 years coming out here on Saturdays, hauling tools, rope, and lunch in a dented cooler. They said he climbed down into that hole like a man keeping an appointment with someone underground. They said, toward the end, he had grown stubborn about it, almost foolish. "Don't seal it," he had written in the will. 5 words, no explanation, no apology. Ethan crossed the cracked ground slowly. Atlas did not look up, but his tail gave one faint thump, as if acknowledging that Ethan had finally heard the first part of the conversation. The wooden cover was gray with sun and age. Someone, Walter probably, had repaired it more than once, replacing boards, oiling the hinges, adding an iron ring thick enough to pull with both hands. Ethan crouched and rested his palm on the lid. The wood was cold, colder than the air. Beneath it, the stone throat of the well held its silence. Behind him, Mara's sedan waited near the road. Beside it stood Daniel Cross from Crossland Development, clean boots, clean truck, clean smile, a folder tucked under one arm with the first offer inside. $46,000, cash, quick closing, no questions asked. It was good money for bad land. That was how Daniel had put it, not cruelly. Almost kindly, that made it worse. Ethan looked east, toward the low hills fading purple in the late light. He thought of Walter's empty chair at the diner that morning, of the chipped white mug Lena Brooks had set on the counter and then taken away without filling. He thought of the way people had spoken of Walter at the funeral: reliable, quiet, decent. Words that sounded like stepping stones across a river too deep to name. Nobody mentioned the well. Nobody mentioned why a man would spend half his Saturdays digging towards something everyone else had stopped believing in. Atlas gave a low sound then, not a bark, not a warning, more like a breath pushed through memory. Ethan turned back. The dog had placed one paw on the lid. His amber eyes were fixed on Ethan, steady and almost sorrowful. For the first time since coming home, Ethan felt the old emptiness inside him shift, not disappear, not heal, just move aside enough to let curiosity pass through. He hooked his fingers through the iron ring. The hinges resisted with a dry groan. Dust scattered, cold air rose from below, smelling of stone, rust, and something faintly mineral, something that did not belong in a dead place. Ethan aimed his flashlight down. The beam fell along hand-laid rock, past rough footholds cut into the wall, farther and farther until the dark swallowed it whole. He should have closed the lid. He should have taken the offer, signed the papers, handed Atlas to Mara, and driven back to the small rental outside Albuquerque, where nothing asked anything of him. Instead, he heard Walter's voice in his head, not from memory exactly, but from all the quiet mornings the old man had ever shared with him. Some things are only empty because nobody stayed long enough to finish them. Atlas stood. Ethan looked at the dog, then at the well, then at the folder in Daniel Cross's hand. And for reasons he could not yet explain, he knew the first real question Walter had left him was not what the land was worth. It was whether Ethan still believed he was worth trusting with something unfinished. The funeral had been small enough for Ethan to count every face, and quiet enough for him to hear the wind worrying the plastic flowers on the neighboring graves. 27 people came, maybe 28 if he counted the mailman who stood near the road with his cap in both hands, not quite entering the cemetery but not leaving either. Walter Briggs had never been the kind of man who collected crowds. He collected measurements, coffee cans full of bolts, county maps with pencil marks in the margins, and neighbors who trusted him with broken pumps, cracked culverts, and questions they were too proud to ask at City Hall. Ethan stood 3 rows back while Pastor Nolan spoke of service, patience, and the kind of goodness that did not announce itself. Atlas sat beside Walter's casket, straight-backed and still, his leash looped around Ethan's wrist, though he did not need holding. Every so often, the shepherd lifted his nose toward the closed wooden box, then lowered his head again as if accepting something Ethan had not yet managed to accept. Mara cried without making a sound. Lena Brooks from the diner dabbed at her eyes with a napkin she must have taken from work. Daniel Cross stood farther off than the others, respectful enough to remove his hat, practical enough to check his phone twice. After the service, people gathered at Walter's little adobe house on Juniper Road, where casserole dishes lined the kitchen counter and grief moved from room to room in low voices. Ethan tried to stand where he would not be in anyone's way. That had become a habit after leaving the army, choosing corners, exits, walls behind him, places where nobody expected him to perform being fine. He wore a dark jacket Walter had once said made him look like a man on his way to apologize. Nobody asked him about that. They asked whether he was sleeping, whether he had work lined up, whether he had someone in Albuquerque checking on him. Each question came wrapped in kindness, but Ethan could feel the small hook inside it. Are you steady? Are you safe? Are you going to become another problem this town has to whisper around? He answered with nods, half smiles, and I'm managing, which was not a lie so much as a door left closed. Atlas stayed close, moving whenever Ethan moved, pressing his shoulder lightly against Ethan's leg when the room grew too warm. Near dusk, after most people had gone, Mara found Ethan in Walter's garage. He was standing in front of the old workbench, looking at a row of tools hung in careful order, wrenches by size, hammers by weight, drill bits tucked into labeled jars. Walter's handwriting was everywhere: pipe fittings, gate hinges, well rope. Mara stood behind him for a while before speaking. He worried about you, she said. Ethan did not turn. Walter worried about everybody, not the same way. Her voice softened, which somehow made it heavier. He knew you were having a hard time. Ethan looked at the jar marked well rope. The letters were faded, but the hand was firm. A lot of people have hard times. Yes, Mara said, but not everyone gets left 38 acres and a dog because of it. That made him turn. She seemed to regret the words the moment they landed, but not enough to take them back. Her eyes were red, her mouth tight, her grief sharpened into responsibility. Ethan, listen to me. I know Walter meant well. I know he saw something in you. But land taxes are real. Repairs are real. That well is dangerous. Atlas needs care. You need stability, not another unfinished thing to carry. Atlas, lying near the door, raised his head. Ethan placed one hand on the workbench, feeling the nicks and worn places where Walter's hands had worked for years. He wanted to say that unfinished things did not scare him. Finished things did. Finished careers, finished friendships, finished versions of himself. People kept trying to mourn while he was still standing in the room. But the words stayed where they usually stayed, behind his teeth. Mara stepped closer. Crossland can make this simple. 46,000 now, maybe more if we move quickly. You could start clean. Ethan almost laughed at that, but it would have sounded unkind. And Mara was not unkind. She was frightened. People often mistook fear for wisdom when it wore sensible shoes and carried paperwork. Did Walter ever tell you why, he asked. Why what? Why the well mattered. Mara looked away toward the open garage door, where the evening light had gone copper over the yard. He said dry didn't mean empty. That was his phrase near the end. Dry doesn't mean empty. Her voice trembled on the last word. I thought it was the illness talking. Ethan looked back at the tools. Atlas rose and came to him, slipping his head beneath Ethan's hand with quiet insistence. The dog's fur was warm, real, grounding. For the first time all day, Ethan breathed all the way in. Mara watched them together, and something in her face changed. Not trust, not yet, but a small confusion in the place where certainty had been. I'm not signing anything tonight, Ethan said. Mara closed her eyes, tired. I figured you'd say that. No, Ethan said, still stroking Atlas's head. You figured I'd refuse because I'm not thinking clearly. There's a difference. The garage went silent, except for the ticking of cooling metal somewhere in Walter's old truck. Mara had no answer for that. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood trees, dry leaves scraping softly against one another like pages turning. That night, Ethan slept in Walter's house because leaving felt too much like another kind of betrayal. The little adobe place on Juniper Road held the day's silence in every room. Plates had been washed and stacked. Folding chairs leaned against the hallway wall. Someone had covered the casseroles with foil and written instructions in blue marker, as if grief could be reheated at 350 degrees for 20 minutes. Ethan stood in the kitchen long after midnight, drinking coffee that had gone cold in Walter's chipped mug. Atlas lay by the back door, not asleep, never quite asleep, his ears moving with each complaint of the old house settling into the desert night. On the refrigerator, Walter had left a grocery list held by a magnet shaped like a roadrunner. Coffee, oats, batteries, pipe tape, ordinary things. That was what undid Ethan more than the funeral. Death made a spectacle of absence, but ordinary things proved it. He touched the word batteries with one finger, then turned away. In the small front room, Walter's recliner sat angled toward a radio that had not been unplugged. Beside it was a wooden side table with a stack of county reports, a magnifying glass, and an old cassette recorder. Ethan almost missed the envelope tucked beneath it. His name was written across the front in Walter's blocky hand. Not formal, not sentimental, just Ethan. He opened it carefully. Inside was one tape and a note. Play this before you decide what the land is. For a long minute he only stared. Atlas rose from the door and came into the room, nails clicking softly on the tile. He sat beside Ethan, close enough that his shoulder touched Ethan's knee. You know about this too, Ethan whispered. Atlas blinked, slow and solemn. Ethan put the cassette in, pressed play, and listened to the old machine catch, hiss and turn. Walter's voice came through thin at first, then steadier, rough with age but unmistakably his. If you're hearing this, I've run out of Saturdays. Ethan closed his eyes. The room seemed to tighten around those words. Walter coughed once on the recording, then continued. I wanted to tell you plain, but plain words are harder when a man is still alive and afraid of sounding foolish. That well isn't dry. Ethan, it's unfinished. Ethan opened his eyes. Atlas lifted his head toward the recorder. Walter spoke of the land then, not like property, but like an old witness. He talked about 1998, when the county had asked him to survey failed wells east of Red Hollow. Most reports called the acreage useless. Too much caliche, too little rainfall, no reliable surface water. But Walter had noticed a contradiction in the samples. Limestone dust at one depth, gray-red clay beneath it. Mineral traces where the maps said there should be none. People see cracked ground and call it dead, Walter said. But the earth keeps more secrets than men do. He had filed his notes. No one read them. He had argued, politely, then firmly, then not at all. Years later, he bought the land himself because he could not stop thinking about what lay under it. Not treasure, he said, and Ethan could almost see his crooked smile. Don't get dramatic on me, Water. Enough to matter. Enough to prove that overlooked things aren't always empty. The tape clicked and hummed. Outside, wind brushed sand against the window glass. Ethan sat very still, coffee forgotten in his hand. Walter's voice softened. I didn't leave you that well because you're broken. I left it because you understand what it means to keep working when nobody claps, when nobody understands, when the work looks foolish from the road. Ethan swallowed hard. That was the first thing anyone had said in a long time that did not feel like sympathy dressed up as concern. The recording went quiet for a few seconds. Then Walter said, Atlas knows the place. He'll take you when you're ready. Don't rush. Don't perform courage. Just listen. At the sound of his name, Atlas stood. He walked to the back door and looked over his shoulder. Ethan gave a tired laugh, one that broke before it became sound. Now the shepherd's tail moved once, not eagerly, patiently. Ethan took the flashlight from Walter's drawer, pulled on his jacket, and followed him into the cold. The night over Red Hollow was clear, stars scattered hard and bright above the mesa. They drove without music, Atlas in the passenger seat, Walter's tape resting between them like a third presence. At the land, the dog stepped out and went straight to the well. Ethan followed, slower this time, no lawyer, no offer folder, no Mara's worried eyes, just the old wooden lid, the black circle beneath it, and the promise of something unfinished. Atlas placed his paw on the cover again. Ethan crouched beside him and whispered into the dark, All right, Walter, I'm listening. Morning came pale and windless, the kind of New Mexico morning that made the whole desert seem undecided between mercy and heat. Ethan woke before 6 in Walter's recliner with a stiff neck, one boot still on, and Atlas standing in front of him as if he had been waiting for the sun to give permission. For a few seconds, Ethan did not remember where he was. Then he saw the cassette recorder on the table, the empty mug, the folded note with his name on it, and memory settled over him like dust. He made coffee because men like Walter had raised him to believe that no serious decision should begin without it. He drank it standing at the sink, watching the first light touch the cottonwoods behind the house. Atlas paced once from the back door to the hall closet and back again. You're not subtle, Ethan muttered. The dog only looked at him. In the garage, Ethan found what he needed almost too easily, as if Walter had arranged the morning years before it arrived. A coil of climbing rope, a safety harness, leather gloves, a steel flashlight, a hard hat with the county seal nearly rubbed away, and a canvas tool bag with well written across the side in black marker. Ethan checked the rope twice, then a third time because some habits were not fear but respect. He packed a small first aid kit, a water bottle, a tape measure, and a dust mask he did not expect to use. Atlas watched every movement from the garage doorway, quiet and grave like a foreman judging the work. By 7, they were back at Briggs' dust lot. The land looked even worse in daylight. 38 acres of cracked earth, brittle rabbit brush, leaning fence posts, and the old stone well, sitting near the center of it all like an eye that had been closed too long. Ethan parked beside the cottonwood stump Walter had used as a work table. He opened the tailgate, set out the tools, and stood there longer than necessary. Going down into a hole was not the hard part. The hard part was admitting he wanted to know what waited at the bottom. Atlas went to the well and put his nose to the wooden lid. Ethan followed, hooked both hands through the iron ring and pulled. The hinges groaned open, sending a shiver up the stone throat below. Cold air rose against his face, carrying the smell of damp rock and old metal. He clipped the rope to the iron post. Walter had sunk into concrete beside the well. The post was weathered but solid. Of course it was. Walter did not build things to almost hold. Ethan tested the knot, leaned his weight back, and felt the line take him. Atlas gave a soft whine. I'll be right here, Ethan said, though that was not exactly true. He swung one leg over the edge and began to descend. The first 10 feet were easy. Walter had cut footholds into the stone, crude but steady, spaced by a man who knew the length of his own stride. At 20 feet, the light above him narrowed. At 30, the air turned cooler. By 40, the sounds of the desert faded until all Ethan could hear was his own breathing, the faint scrape of his boots, and Atlas shifting somewhere high above. The well seemed less like a hole than a memory made vertical. Every mark in the stone was proof that Walter had been here again and again, lowering himself into silence. When the rest of town had gone to church, ball games, errands, Sunday dinners, at 64 feet, Ethan's boots touched packed earth. He stood still, letting his eyes adjust. The flashlight beam moved across the bottom, a folding stool, a rusted hand pick, a small stack of flat stones, a pencil worn to almost nothing. Then the light caught green metal tucked behind a ledge cut into the wall. Ethan crouched. It was an old ammunition box, sealed with duct tape gone brittle at the edges. Across the top, in Walter's handwriting, were 5 words, "For the man who continues." Ethan sat back on his heels. Above him, Atlas barked once, sharp and brief, and the sound fell down the well like a question. Ethan cut the tape carefully with his pocket knife and opened the lid. Inside was a leather notebook wrapped in oilcloth, 3 envelopes, a folded geological map, a small brass compass, and a photograph of Walter standing beside the well years earlier, younger, sunburned, smiling like a man who had already seen water no one else believed in. Ethan lifted the first envelope. "For the man who comes after me." His hands, steady all morning, finally trembled. Not badly, just enough to remind him he was alive. Ethan did not read the letter first. For reasons he could not have explained, he opened the notebook instead, as if the facts might be safer than Walter's heart. The leather cover was soft from use, darkened at the corners by years of dust, oil, and weather. Inside, Walter's handwriting moved across the pages in careful lines, dates in the left margin, measurements in the right, notes tucked between them like thoughts he had not trusted anyone else to hold. June 14, 1998. Surface caliche harder than expected. Wind out of the west. No visible moisture. Local opinion, useless ground, my opinion. Too early to insult the land. Ethan smiled before he could stop himself. That sounded like Walter. Not sentimental, not grand. Just stubborn in a clean, practical way. He turned the pages slowly. The notebook was not a diary exactly. But Walter was in every sentence. He wrote about soil color, stone hardness, rope wear, weather depth, and the way the air changed at certain levels. He wrote about limestone dust appearing where county maps insisted there should be none. He wrote about gray-red clay pulled from 56 feet, mineral traces at 59, cooler air below 60. He had sketched the well in cross-section again and again, each drawing a little more certain than the last. Ethan unfolded the geological map and spread it across his knees. Pencil lines ran beneath the old property boundary, converging at the well. Walter had circled a thin band beneath the clay and written, "Perched aquifer, likely confined, low volume but renewable if protected." Beside it was another note, "Not enough for industry. Enough for a garden, enough for people." That was when Ethan stopped. Not enough for industry, enough for people. He read the words twice, then a third time, feeling them settle into him with a weight no appraisal could measure. Above, Atlas moved around the mouth of the well, paws scraping softly on wood and dust. A thin rain of grit drifted down through the light. Ethan looked up toward the pale circle of sky, then back at the notebook. Walter's work had begun as county research and become something quieter, almost sacred. Every Saturday for 26 years, the old man had lowered himself into this stone throat and removed what stood between the surface and water. Not much at a time. Sometimes 6 inches. Sometimes 2, some days nothing but notes. Some entries were short enough to hurt. January 9, 2009. Hands too stiff. Sat at bottom 20 minutes. Listened. April 22, 2015. Mara says sell before taxes rise. Did not argue. Hard to explain water to someone holding bills. October 3, 2021. Atlas refused to leave the rim today. Nose down, ears forward. He knows something changed. Ethan touched that line with his thumb. The dog had been part of it longer than he knew. Not a witness from the outside, but a keeper of the work. He read on. Walter had not been chasing a fantasy. He had known exactly how much farther he needed to go. At 64 feet, the bottom had reached compacted red clay. The next layer, if his readings were right, would be the seal, beneath that water. Maybe 15 feet, maybe 16. Maybe less if the winter recharge had shifted pressure. Walter's last full entry was dated 8 months earlier, depth holding at 64 feet, left hip unreliable, breathing poor. If I stop here, let it not be because the water failed, but because the body did. The sentence blurred. Ethan took off one glove and pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes. He had seen plenty of unfinished things in his life. Roads ending in desert, rooms half repaired, men who came home carrying invisible debris and never found a place to put it down. But this was different. This was not abandonment. This was a hand extended from the past, rough-palmed and patient, saying, "I got it this far, you can take it from here." He finally opened the first envelope. The paper inside smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Walter's letter began without ceremony. "Ethan, people respect finished things. They stand in the shade and praise the tree, but they rarely thank the man who planted it when the ground looked dead. They drink the water and forget the years of dirt. Don't let that make you bitter. Let it make you careful. The world will call many people useless because it cannot see what is still gathering under them. Don't become one of those people who only believes in a thing after it gives you something." Ethan lowered the letter to his lap. In the silence, the well seemed to breathe around him. He thought of Mara saying burden, Daniel Cross saying bad land, people asking whether he was sleeping, whether he was steady, whether he had plans. He had been measured too, not by instruments, but by glances, pauses, lowered voices. Walter had seen the same world and chosen another method. Measure deeper, wait longer, respect what is hidden. Ethan folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. Then he picked up the notebook again and turned to the final page. There, in darker ink, Walter had written one last line. "The last 16 feet are not about water, Ethan. They are about whether you still believe your hands can build something good." Above him, Atlas barked once more, and this time Ethan answered. "Yeah," he called up, his voice rough in the stone dark. I heard him. By the time Ethan climbed out of the well, the morning had turned hard and bright, the kind of desert light that left nothing softened. Dust clung to his jacket, his gloves, the lines beside his mouth. Atlas met him at the rim with a low, relieved sound and pressed his forehead against Ethan's chest. Not excited, not dramatic, just certain. Ethan stood there for a while, with one hand buried in the shepherd's fur and the other resting on the metal box. Walter had hidden 64 feet below the earth. He should have felt foolish. A grown man, a veteran, standing on a dead lot with dirt in his teeth and an old notebook under his arm, thinking 16 feet of clay might change anything. But foolishness, he was beginning to understand, was not believing in something unfinished. Foolishness was letting strangers name it before it had a chance to speak. He had just set the box on the tailgate when 2 vehicles rolled up the dirt track. Mara's white sedan and behind it Daniel Cross's black pickup, polished so clean it seemed embarrassed to be on that road. Mara stepped out first, shielding her eyes from the sun. Daniel followed with a folder in one hand and a smile that had been practiced in rooms with air conditioning. "Morning, Ethan," Daniel said. "Didn't expect to find you already working." Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans. Wasn't working, looking. Daniel glanced at the open well, then at the rope, then at Atlas, who had moved quietly to Ethan's side. "That hole makes people nervous," he said. "And nervous things become expensive things." Mara gave him a warning look, but Daniel continued gently, as if gentleness made the words less sharp. "I don't mean that unkindly. Liability alone is something to consider. One bad step, one cracked stone, one accident no one saw coming, and suddenly Walter's old dream becomes your financial ruin." Ethan said nothing. He had learned long ago that some men spoke in concern the way others wore cologne. Too much of it meant they were covering something. Daniel opened the folder and laid a paper on the tailgate beside Walter's box. "Crossland is still prepared to offer $46,000. Cash closing. We absorb transfer fees. No drawn-out inspection. You walk away clean, clean." There it was again, that word people used when they wanted the past swept off like sawdust. Ethan looked at the offer, then at the dry acres stretching behind it. From the road, Daniel was right. The place looked worthless. A few fence posts, a dead windmill, a well no one trusted, and a man no one knew quite how to speak to. Mara stepped closer. "Ethan, no one is trying to take anything from you." "Then why does it feel like everyone is in a hurry?" he asked. The question landed softly, but Mara looked down. Daniel gave a small sigh, not impatient, only polished. Because sometimes delay costs people. You've been through a lot. Everyone knows that. Sometimes a person needs permission to choose the practical thing. Ethan felt the old heat rise in him, not anger exactly, but the ache of being handled. Practical for who? Daniel's smile faded by one careful inch. For a man starting over, Atlas shifted then, stepping just slightly ahead of Ethan, not threatening, simply present. Daniel noticed and took half a step back before pretending he had meant to. Mara's face tightened with embarrassment. Ethan saw it all, the fear, the caution, the paperwork, the assumption that his silence was confusion, and his grief was weakness. He opened Walter's notebook to the last page and laid it beside the offer. The wind lifted the corner of Daniel's contract, but Walter's notebook stayed flat beneath Ethan's palm. Walter didn't think this land was bad, Ethan said. He thought it was unfinished. Daniel looked at the stained pages without touching them. With respect, Walter was 73 and sick. With respect, Ethan replied. He was also a water engineer who measured this ground for 26 years. Mara looked up sharply. For the first time, doubt moved across her face. Not doubt in Ethan, but doubt in the story she had accepted because it was easier than hope. Daniel closed the folder slowly. If you change your mind, the offer won't sit forever. Most things worth keeping don't, Ethan said. After they left, dust followed their tires back toward the road, hanging in the air long after the vehicles were gone. Ethan stood beside the tailgate until the silence returned. Then Atlas nudged the notebook with his nose. Ethan looked down at Walter's handwriting, then at the well, then at his own dirt-caked hands. All right, he said quietly. We don't sell what we haven't understood yet. Jonah Price first heard about the well from 3 men at Miller's Hardware who had never dug deeper than a fence post, but spoke as if the earth had personally disappointed them. Ethan was at the back of the store, comparing pulley hooks, when one of them said, Walter's veteran is out there chasing ghosts now. The words were not loud, but they were meant to travel. Jonah, crouched near the counter with grease on his hands and a carburetor spring between his teeth, looked up. He was 27, lean in the way of men who forgot meals until their stomachs reminded them, with sandy hair that never stayed combed and eyes too tired for his age. He fixed lawn mowers, tractors, pumps, whatever people brought him, and still owed money to a community college he had stopped attending 2 years earlier. Ethan had seen him around town, usually under the hood of something that should have died in the last decade. You know rigging? Ethan asked. Jonah took the spring from his mouth. Enough not to stand under what I'm lifting. Good. Ethan set 2 pulley hooks, a coil of utility line, and a pair of leather gloves on the counter. I need a second man at the well. One of the older men gave a soft laugh. Jonah did not. He studied Ethan, then Atlas, who sat beside the door watching the store like he owned the air in it. What's it pay? $20 an hour. Cash at the end of the day. Lunch if I remember to buy it. You won't? Lena Brooks called from the front, where she had come in for coffee filters. Men like you call black coffee a food group. Jonah almost smiled. By noon he was standing at Briggs' dust lot, looking down into the open well with his hands on his hips. You're telling me an old man dug this by hand? Most of it, Ethan said. For 26 years? That's what the notebook says. Jonah whistled low, not mocking now. Respect had entered his face quietly, as if it had found a side door. Ethan showed him the setup, the iron post, the main rope, the bucket line, the safety harness, the way Walter had cut footholds into the stone. Atlas lay near the rim, nose stretched toward the opening, ears twitching at sounds too small for men. They worked slowly at first. Jonah went down while Ethan managed the line above, measuring each load, calling checks, keeping the rhythm steady. The first buckets came up heavy with packed red clay. Nothing dramatic, no miracle smell, just dirt that resisted being moved. Jonah climbed out after an hour with his shirt damp and his forearms streaked dark. That bottom's hard as fired brick, he said, breathing through his nose. Walter wrote the seal would be stubborn. Walter write anything about my back, only that complaining doesn't move dirt. Jonah laughed then, short and surprised, and something loosened between them. By late afternoon they had removed less than a foot. It should have discouraged them. Instead, Ethan found himself calmer than he had been in months. The work had edges, rope, bucket, measure, rest. No speeches, no pity. No one asking if he was all right, while looking ready for the answer to scare them. Just a task, and another man willing to do it. Atlas rose each time a bucket came up, sniffing the clay with solemn attention. On the fifth load after 4 o'clock, the shepherd's tail moved once, slow and deliberate. Jonah noticed. He always inspects dirt, only when it matters. And does it? Ethan rubbed the clay between his gloved fingers. It was cooler than the morning loads, darker too, with a faint gray streak running through it. Not water, not yet, but not nothing. He opened Walter's notebook on the tailgate and found the matching description. Red-gray clay, increased density, mineral odor, continue with patience. Jonah leaned over his shoulder. You understand all that, some. Think I could? Ethan looked at him, really looked. Not as a hired hand, not as another person passing through the edge of his life, but as a man standing in the dust beside him, waiting to be taken seriously. Yeah, Ethan said, I think you could. Jonah's face changed in a small, careful way, the way a dry field changes when one cloud finally believes in it. They worked until sunset, until the sky went orange behind the mesa and the first coolness settled over the land. At the end of the day, Ethan counted out the cash, but Jonah did not leave right away. He stood by the well looking down into the dark. Same time tomorrow, he asked. Ethan glanced at Atlas. The dog had rested his chin on the rim, eyes half closed, as if listening to something far below. Same time, Ethan said. By the end of the first week, the well had become the kind of story Red Hollow carried from place to place without ever admitting it cared. It followed men through the aisles of Miller's Hardware, drifted over coffee cups at Lena's Diner, and settled under the dryers at the laundromat, where people folded shirts and pretended not to listen. Ethan heard pieces of it everywhere he went. Some said Walter Briggs had been right all along. Some said grief had made Ethan too stubborn to see a bad idea. Some said Atlas was the only sensible creature on that land, and even that was debatable. Ethan did not answer any of it. Each morning he drove out before sunrise with Atlas in the passenger seat and Walter's notebook on the dash. Jonah arrived 10 minutes later in a blue pickup that coughed smoke and carried more tools than Faith. They worked in rhythm now. Jonah below, Ethan above, then Ethan below, Jonah above. Rope, bucket, measure, rest. Clay came up dark and stubborn, clinging to metal like it had waited 26 years and resented being disturbed. Atlas inspected every load, sometimes indifferent, sometimes suddenly alert, nose working, ears forward, amber eyes narrowed toward the well as if he could hear Walter's calculations still ticking underground. On the 8th day, Lena Brooks came down the dirt track just before noon in her old station wagon. She parked crooked, got out with 2 paper bags and a thermos, and looked at them with the unimpressed tenderness of a woman who had fed half the town and forgiven the other half. You boys eating at noon, she said, or still pretending coffee counts if it's hot enough. Jonah climbed out of the well, streaked with red clay from his boots to his jaw. Depends what's in the bag. Turkey, mustard, pickles. Apple pie if you don't act entitled. Ethan took off his gloves, unsure what to do with the kindness. That was the strange thing about help. Emergencies made it simple. A man bleeding, a roof burning, a truck stuck in a wash. Help had a shape then. But ordinary help, a sandwich, a thermos, a woman standing in the sun because she noticed 2 men forgetting lunch, could feel more dangerous. It asked you to admit you were seen. Lena set the food on Walter's old stump. He used to sit right there, she said, nodding toward it. Every Saturday after his wife died. Said the land was quieter than people. Ethan looked at the stump. He never told me that. Walter never told anybody anything straight if he could hide it in a chore. Atlas came to her and sat politely. Lena tore off a piece of turkey and held it out. Don't look at me like that, old man. You're the only one out here with manners. After Lena came others. Not all at once, never in a way that made it feel organized. A retired electrician named Roy Alvarez left a pump motor in Ethan's truck bed, with a note that said might still have one good season. A rancher dropped off pipe lengths he claimed were taking up space, though they were stacked neat and recently cleaned. Mara left a box of new gloves on Walter's porch and drove away before Ethan could thank her. Even Daniel Cross returned once, stopping by the road without getting out, watching the slow rise and fall of the bucket line before driving off again. Red Hollow did not know how to apologize, not directly. It loaned tools. It brought food. It said, had this lying around, when everybody knew it had not. Ethan felt the town's attention pressing closer, and with it came discomfort he had not expected. Solitude had been easier when it could call itself discipline. Needing no one had sounded strong until people began showing up anyway, quietly, without asking him to perform gratitude. On the 10th afternoon, Jonah paused at the bottom and called up, "You ever think maybe this is what Walter wanted?" Ethan leaned over the rim. "Water? No. People having a reason to come back out here." The question stayed with Ethan after Jonah climbed up, after they packed the tools, after the sunset turned the wellstones copper. He looked across the land and imagined Walter sitting on the stump alone all those Saturdays, not lonely exactly, but waiting for a future he might never stand in. Maybe the well had never been just a way to reach water. Maybe it was a way to bring people low enough, quiet enough, close enough to remember the ground beneath them was shared. Atlas rested his head against Ethan's thigh. This time, Ethan did not pull away from the comfort. On the 18th morning, the dirt changed. It was not dramatic at first, no sudden gush, no shout from below, no miracle bright enough to make a believer out of the whole town in one breath. It was only a color, a darker seam running through the clay in Jonah's bucket. Red deepening toward brown with thin gray veins folded through it like smoke trapped in stone. Ethan noticed it before Jonah did. Atlas noticed it before both of them. The shepherd had been lying in the shade of the truck, chin on his paws, his old body still except for the steady movement of his nose. When the bucket cleared the rim, Atlas stood so quickly Ethan turned. The dog walked to the clay, lowered his muzzle, and breathed in. Not a casual sniff, not curiosity, recognition. His ears came forward and his tail moved once, slow as a pendulum. "What is it?" Jonah called from below. Ethan did not answer right away. He broke a piece of clay between his fingers. It held together longer than the earlier loads. Heavy and cool, leaving a faint dampness on the leather of his glove, he lifted it closer. The smell was there, buried under dust and iron, mineral. Clean, almost cold. Walter's notebook lay open on the tailgate. The pages weighted with a wrench against the wind. Ethan turned to the marked section, though by then he nearly knew the words by heart. Red-gray clay at final seal. Temperature drop, increased weight, mineral odor. Continue with patience. He read the last sentence twice. Continue with patience. Jonah climbed up 10 minutes later, face streaked with clay, eyes searching Ethan's. "Don't say almost unless you mean it," he said. Ethan handed him the notebook. Jonah read, lips moving without sound, then looked down at the well as if it had become deeper in a different way. "So we're close." "Close isn't water." "No," Jonah said, "but it ain't nothing." That afternoon the work slowed instead of speeding up. Ethan insisted on it. They checked rope knots, reset the pulley, reinforced the bucket handle, logged each foot, each color shift, each change in texture. Hope made men careless if they let it. Walter had written that too. By 4 o'clock Mara arrived in the white sedan, dust following her down the track like a second thought. She got out with a paper bag from Lena's diner. But when she saw Jonah's clothes, Ethan's hands, and Atlas standing rigid beside the well, the bag lowered slowly to her side. "What happened? The clay changed," Ethan said. Mara looked at the open notebook on the tailgate. For once, she did not pretend the pages were only an old man's obsession. She touched the corner of one sheet with 2 fingers, careful as if paper could bruise. "Walter talked about red clay," she said quietly. "At the end. I thought he was just repeating himself." Ethan looked toward the well. Maybe he was trying to make sure somebody remembered. Her face tightened. The desert wind pulled a strand of silver hair loose from her pin and laid it across her cheek. "You look exhausted." "I am." "Then stop for today." He almost refused because refusal had become easier than admitting limits. But Atlas stepped between them and leaned against Ethan's leg, warm, solid, insistent. Ethan let out a breath. "One more measure," he said, "then we stop." Jonah went down with the tape and called up the number. 78 feet and 4 inches. The words hung there in the late light. According to Walter's map, they were within 2 feet of the pressure layer. No one cheered. Jonah climbed out slowly. Mara sat on Walter's old stump, the diner bag forgotten beside her. Ethan stood with one hand on Atlas' neck and watched the shadow of the well stretch across the ground. For years, people had called this place empty, because emptiness was easier to understand than patience. Now the earth was answering in signs small enough to miss if a person came only to judge. Atlas gave one short bark toward the darkening hole. Not warning, not fear, a simple announcement. Something below had finally begun to speak. On the 24th morning, the sky over Red Hollow opened clear and blue, without a single cloud to share the blame if hope failed. Ethan arrived before sunrise, but Jonah was already there, sitting on Walter's old stump with a thermos between his boots and clay under his fingernails from the day before. Atlas lay beside the well, not sleeping, his muzzle resting on his paws, his amber eyes fixed on the wooden rim, as if he had kept watch through the dark for Walter. For Ethan, maybe for the land itself. No one said much. Some mornings were too full for talking. They checked the rope, the pulley, the harness, the bucket. Ethan logged the depth in Walter's notebook, 79 feet 11 inches. Jonah went down first. His voice rose from the well, hollow and steady. Clay's softening. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. Atlas stood. A bucket came up, heavier than usual, the clay inside dark and slick, clinging in one piece like wet pottery. Ethan touched it, cold, not cool, cold. By mid-morning, Lena had parked near the fence with coffee and biscuits. Roy Alvarez stood beside his old pump motor, pretending he had come only to see whether it still had parts worth salvaging. Mara arrived last, carrying nothing this time. Not food, not gloves, not papers, just herself. She stood near the tailgate and watched Ethan lower the empty bucket into the ground. Nobody crowded the rim, nobody made jokes. Even the wind seemed to step back. At 10:43, Jonah called up Ethan, one word, not loud. But every person on that land heard the difference in it. Ethan clipped himself to the rope and descended. The stone walls were damp near the bottom now, shining faintly in the flashlight beam. Jonah stood ankle-deep in clay, one hand pressed against the east wall. A thin line had appeared there, no wider than a thread, running through the red seal. At first, Ethan thought it was only a crack. Then a bead formed. It swelled, trembled, and slid down the wall, leaving a dark trail behind it. Water. The word did not leave his mouth. It did not need to. Another bead followed, then another. Jonah laughed once, not with humor but disbelief, the sound breaking open in the cold air. Ethan took the handpick and worked gently around the seam, careful, as if waking someone who had slept 26 years. The clay gave way with a soft sigh. A narrow stream pushed through, cloudy and mineral-rich, spilling over his glove, down his wrist, into the dirt at his boots. Above them, Atlas barked. Once, twice, then the whole rim seemed to come alive with voices. Ethan stood frozen, water darkening the ground around him. Walter's last 16 feet finally answered. He thought he would feel triumph. Instead, what came first was grief. Not the drowning kind, the clean kind, the kind that washes a name before it lets it rest. He was right, Jonah whispered. Ethan looked at the stream, at the stone, at the work of old hands and young hands meeting in the same dark. No, he said, voice rough. He was patient. By noon, the water had pooled shallow at the bottom, enough to wet their boots, enough to make everyone quiet. When Ethan climbed out, Atlas pushed into him so hard he nearly lost balance. The shepherd's fur smelled of dust and sun. Ethan buried one hand in his neck and laughed, a broken, grateful sound that surprised even Mara. She covered her mouth, not to hide sorrow this time, but wonder. In the months that followed, the land changed slowly, the way honest things do. Roy's pump motor worked after all. Jonah helped Ethan set pipe and build a small irrigation line. Lena brought seeds and then recipes. Mara came on Saturdays, sometimes to help, sometimes just to sit where Walter had sat and listen to the pump handle squeak. The first tomatoes were small. The beans came late. The squash spread like it had been waiting underground with the water. They named it Briggswell Garden, not because it was grand, but because it was true. Veterans from 2 towns over came to fix fencing and learn water systems. Unemployed men and women came to work for a day, then stayed for a season. Nobody was asked to explain the worst thing that had happened to them before being handed a shovel. Nobody had to prove they were healed before being trusted with something living. Atlas aged into the place like a guardian carved from warmth, sleeping under the shade beside the well, opening one eye whenever the pump began to sing. One evening, nearly a year after Walter's funeral, Ethan set 2 mugs of coffee on the porch rail, one for himself, one beside Walter's old cap. The garden lay green in the low sun, impossible and real. Atlas rested against his boot. Ethan looked across the rows and finally understood the inheritance. Walter had not left him money. He had left him unfinished earth, a dog who refused to quit, and a place where forgotten people could remember they were still worth trusting.